Welcome to the Zachrilege Cast podcast, YouTube video interview program that features me talking to some of the best and brightest in the atheist slash secular slash awesome community. This is episode number 70. We're recording live on October 4th, 2016. Thank you again to Andrew Torres of the Opening Arguments podcast for being on last week and for giving us approximately 10 hours of podcasting goodness last week. Like I said, episode 70, and this is the second time we'll take the interview outside North America. Most people listening know what the score is, more or less, in the United States when it comes to religion. But what about Ireland? We never think about their feelings. John Hamill is the Secretary of Atheist in Ireland International, and he's part of Atheist Alliance International. Thanks for being flexible and trying this on the second take, and welcome aboard.
I'm absolutely delighted to be here. So I think it's a little later for me than it is for you, Zach, and that's why you're still on the beer and I'm on the whiskey.
I know.
Sláinte.
That's quite a transition. That's one I haven't quite been able to make. I'll drink kind of the heavier beers, but the brown liquor, I haven't quite, matured yet, or, someday.
Maybe you need to try some Irish stuff. There's a lot of that Scotch stuff going around. You want to steer clear of that?
Yeah, although my dad's side of the family is from Scotland, so I don't know. We'll see. But I am having a Cigar City Maduro is the opener, and then we like to close it up. Sierra Nevada Oktoberfest. I don't know how you guys feel about Germany, but there's an actual German beer.
Very good.
So let's begin tonight's talk. Can you talk about your personal religious background?
Sure. So I was brought up as a Roman Catholic in Belfast, in an area of Belfast called Andersonstown at the top of the Falls Road. So for people who don't know the geography of Belfast, that's the part that you know from the news which used to happen. So my parents were quite religious and devout, and my mother is still a very pious Catholic. So one of the quirks that we have in Ireland at the minute is that you're possibly not familiar with the Angelus, Zach. So the Angelus is the Angelus bells are the Roman Catholic call to Marian prayer, which is supposed to be recited at 12 midday and 6 p.m. Every day. So at those times, our national broadcaster, RTE, which is the closest thing we have to the BBC, they play the Angelus bells. So when I was growing up, we used to say the Angelus daily. And before that, we used to say Decades of the Rosary daily, the whole family. So at the minute when the Angelus bells are played on RTE, I'm the only person in the house who knows all the words to the Angelus, and my kids think it's a bit of an oddity. But it's just a hangover from quite a pious Catholic upbringing. So I guess I have the same process as moving away from the faith as a lot of other people. It's kind of a reasonably slow process, but I remember in my 30s, which is about 10 years ago, I'm 43 now, I saw an interview with Penn Jillette, and I've since learned that this comment isn't original to Penn Jillette. I think Isaac Asimov and Mark Twain have said something similar. But in the interview, he talked about the Bible as the best tool for creating atheists. And he said, if you've ever any doubts about your Christianity, just go off and read the Bible. And I was having lots of doubts at that time, so that's what I did. I skipped the Old Testament and the Psalms. In fairness, I think a lot of Christians dismiss the Old Testament anyway. And I just read the New Testament cover to cover. And that made my mind up. I remember my strongest reaction to reading the material was that it's just incredibly dull. And if you give the book the context that is proposed for it. In other words, there's an invisible character called Yahweh who created the universe 14 billion years ago, and he's been waiting all of this time just for us to come around. And 2,000 years ago, he finally put his plan into action and left us with this special book. And if you give the book that context and lift it up and just start reading, I just thought the creator of the universe couldn't possibly be this dull and boring. And that's really what made my mind up.
Well, it's a good way to go. And even had a pastor on this show, and he said he didn't even finish reading the Old Testament because it's just kind of names at points and talks about family backgrounds. And yeah, I don't know. It's interesting to talk to somebody from Europe, because in the U.S. we always think of the Europe in general as this godless region, whereas we have a separation of church and state, but people won't shut up about religion. And then in most European countries, they have an official or close to official religion, and people kind of sort of ignore it. I don't know if that's
I think
you've seen the change over there.
Indeed, I think the USA and Ireland are both outliers for almost precisely the opposite reasons. So you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the US is an outlier in that it has an explicitly secular constitution and strong legislation around the separation of church and state, whereas the population is quite religious. And I think Ireland is almost the precise opposite in that we have an increasingly secular population, but we have a lot of legislation that originates in a time when the Catholic Church was quite dominant. So we have a population that's really quite liberal, and I think broadly in favour of the separation of church and state, but the legal framework just doesn't look like that. So if you look at the census will say the country is 84% Catholic, but that really comes with an asterisk in that a lot of those people are cultural Catholics. When they tick the Catholic box, really what they mean is that they have a Catholic heritage rather than they accept Catholic doctrine. So, for example, there's a survey that the Irish Catholic bishops do every year, which measures to what extent Mass attending Catholics adhere to the doctrine. And only 50% believe in hell. And if you go through a lot of the social teachings around homosexuality or contraception, 60-70% of people who take the trouble to go to Mass every Sunday don't accept the church teachings on those points. And in fact, 10% of Mass attending Catholics, consistently 10% over many years, don't believe in God. So you think that's a pretty low bar to get over before you call yourself a Catholic, that you believe in God. But the marriage equality referendum that we had last year was, I think, a good measure of that. So it passed with almost a 2-to-1 majority, even though the Catholic Church campaigned strongly against gay marriage. And if you look at the numbers, there's no way the vote for gay marriage in Ireland would have been that high if it wasn't for lots of Catholics voting for it. So a lot of the people in Ireland who call themselves Catholic are really cultural Catholics in that they have that kind of heritage, but they don't really accept all of the doctrine. And then on the other side of the ledger, if you like, we have a lot of laws in Ireland which come from a time when the country really was dominated by Catholicism. So, for example, you have to take a religious oath to become a judge or president or prime minister or deputy prime minister. And the education system and the health system have lots of different provisions that favour Catholics and favour the religious over the non-religious.
Yeah, we have some of those laws here in a lot of states. We have, it's like, you can't be an atheist and run for office, which is technically unconstitutional, but to actually get that repealed is very unlikely. So, Yeah, it's odd. Like if someone tells me they're a Christian, I'm like, man, I got way more questions. That doesn't really clear it up for me.
Yeah, I think you have a lot of Catholic hospitals in the States also that have their own particular restrictions on the different treatments that they're permitted to provide, especially around abortion and things like that.
That is kind of crazy that yeah, the Catholic Church is starting to buy up all these big hospitals and are actually doing treatment. I know some people who've actually like a woman wants to get her tubes tied, and they're like, yeah,
Hmm.
but you still can have kids. Like they don't just say, okay, here's how we can do it. It's the trying to talk her out of it, or even like prohibiting her, which is odd. So it's all kind of
Yeah.
tied together in a weird way. They'll throw the baby out with the bathwater kind of deal.
Uh-huh.
So let's chat about your podcast. So the Free Thought Prophet. How'd you get together to do a multi-continental podcast?
Yeah, so for me, it started last year. I was a guest on my now good friend Seamus's podcast, and as he tells the story, we had a lot of fun, and he asked me back to help. And as I tell the story, I was a guest and just refused to go away. So we did a few kind of written blogs and a lot of other podcasts after that. I don't think we put too much effort into the social media world of, I mean, the different mechanisms that exist to promote things and recruit subscribers are a bit of a mystery to me. But Seamus does a great job of getting some really well-known people on as guests, and we have a few drinks and have some fun. So one of our recent podcasts was Dr. Julian Bajini, who's written some books on determinism and free will. And he described our podcast at the end as a combination of essentially an informal booze up and some intellectual conversation. And perhaps we don't reach that standard very often, but that's what we're aiming for. And we certainly have fun trying.
See, it's the terminology, like the British slang and Irish slang. Like booze up. It's just better than better than what we have here. It's like let's get some drinks. No, how about it? We have a booze up. Just
Yeah,
takes it to the next level.
Dr. Bajini described Seamus and I as pub philosophers. I guess that would be bar philosophers in the States, would it?
Well, the last a couple interviews ago, and the show I was on a couple weeks ago, Skeptics Brew Pub said, you need a 2 drink minimum, and I like that concept of the show. So once you joined, is it pretty much universal that the two of you and Seamus are doing the interviews every week, or however often you do the show?
Yeah, we have at least once a week. Normally we have a guest every week, and we also try and do what we call Bible study. So, really coming back to the story I described in terms of reading the Bible as a mechanism to create atheists. Seamus also has a particular interest in Jesus mythicism and scriptural analysis. So essentially, what we do in a number of episodes is compare each of the four gospels. So we have them side by side, and we'll step through and read some of the verses and comment on those. And then we've also had some scholars in that area to come on and discuss the same issues with us. So Dr. Robert Price and Dr. Richard Carrier, who are both Jesus mythicists, have been on to have those kind of discussions with us. And that's great fun too. Guys like Robert Price are a lot of fun to talk to. I remember last time we were talking with him, we were discussing the nativity, and you'll be familiar with the story where the angel comes to Bethlehem to warn Joseph and Mary that Herod's soldiers are coming, and Herod's soldiers are going to slaughter all the babies in the town. And Jesus and Mary and Joseph flee off to Egypt. and Dr. Price talked for about 10 minutes about why didn't the angel tell anyone else in Bethlehem? He appeared to Joseph in the middle of the night, and they all sneaked off, and apparently were happy to leave the rest of the town to be slaughtered by the soldiers, or the innocents at least. So there's lots of things that just never occurred to me when you're familiar with those stories as they are taught in Catholic schools, as I went to. And people who are genuine scriptural scholars can give you a lot of history in terms of how those stories were arrived at and where they came from. And of course, point out some of the rather large holes in the narrative.
Yeah, I would just guess that whoever wrote these stories or whoever repurposed the older stories wasn't really thinking too hard about plot holes, and people are going to really be analyzing the crap out of these in 2,000 years.
That's right. That's right.
But that's one of the, as you make the journey kind of through atheism, you make these discoveries, and the whole Jesus mythicism thing kind of threw me for a loop. It's like, wait a second, there's not much, if any, historical evidence of this most important person in the most important book ever. And it's good that there are a lot of scholars out there, and we'll see. There are some people kind of debunking it, but I feel like the arguments aren't terribly great, but it's an intriguing concept. I'll at least give it that. I mean, I don't know if you're fully on board on the mythicism train, or if you're kind of like, I just want to learn about this.
Yeah, well, I can't claim to be an expert, but I've listened carefully to Richard Carrier and Robert Price, and they certainly make a very convincing story. So I'd say, I mean, the Richard Carrier's material in particular seems very well researched, and Robert Price is just such a compelling guy to listen to, in terms of how knowledgeable he is. So they make a very compelling case for how the story came together without an actual historic Jesus character ever existing.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, that's the problem is sometimes I set up these questions and then you've already answered the next three, because, I try to ask, for people who do podcasts, I try to ask, well, do you drink during the podcast? And the answer is obviously yes. And then the question is, do you expect people listening or watching to drink? And I think the answer would be yes, unless you're operating a motor vehicle, except unless you're in the state of Kentucky, because it's probably legal there. But are there any other guests you had in the show that kind of jump out, or people that you really look forward to talking to? I mean, you've mentioned a few names, but all your kids are your favorite, right? Is that how it goes?
Well, the one that really stands out for me is Richard Sipe. So, if anyone has seen the movie Spotlight, he appears as a character. He's a pretty pivotal character in the story, but in the movie, he's always at the end of the phone. He never appears on screen, if you like. But if you remember the story, the journalists at one point are talking to Richard Sipe on the phone as this church's own expert in priests who sexually abuse kids. And he gave them the figure of 6%. 6% of all Catholic priests at any one time are actively abusing children. And based on that, the journalists extrapolated that there must be many, many more of these priests, and they went off to find lots and lots more. And they would routinely check back in with Richard Sipe in the movie. So, Richard talked with us about his background and how he came to be the church's expert in this area. And I think most interestingly, the work that he did after that Boston Globe expose. So he has since raised that figure. It's now 9% of Catholic priests at any one time are actively abusing kids, which is just an incredible number. And the other figure that I remember from that interview because he scolded me gently during the interview. I remember I asked him a question about celibacy. So I asked if the church requirement that Catholic priests must be celibate is one of the causes of the higher incidence of pedophilia among Catholic priests. And he scolded me that the church does not have a celibate priesthood. So that can't really be the cause because, again, at any one time, only 50% of Catholic priests are actually celibate. So, yeah, his view is that the majority of priests are not celibate, and the majority of them have either homosexual or heterosexual relationships with other consenting adults, which is fine in my book, although it leaves them open to a charge of hypocrisy, I think, when they denounce the same kind of behavior from the pulpit. But yeah, Richard's an incredibly impressive guy and very knowledgeable in that he was a priest for, I think, 19 years and a qualified psychologist who treated these offending priests on behalf of the church. So he certainly knows what he's talking about.
Yeah, that was the episode I listened to earlier today. So it's number 14. Put this in the show notes so everybody can check it out. And yeah, the number, like I imagine this, my brother and sister-in-law have kids and they're raising them Catholic and they're going to a Catholic school. Imagine saying to them, so if you wanted to take your kids to a daycare and you heard that 6% of all kids in daycares get molested, would you take them to daycare? Probably not. But
Yeah.
put them in Catholic school, put them in through the ringer of making them eat Jesus. That's okay because people don't know about it. And that was the takeaway. Richard Sipe is like, just be honest. All the stuff he said was just, kind of blew me away. But the fact that he's still kind of a believer and still like Catholic was
that's
almost
true.
the part that, like, it was almost like talking to Robert M. Price about Donald Trump. When you talk about like the Catholic, all of a sudden he was kind of backing up.
Yeah,
Like,
it's
it was this like, there's this other thing outside of provable fact, and that's what my religion is. That was an intriguing finish, but it didn't really take away from anything that happened before. But just interesting little footnote kind of on the episode, I guess.
Yeah, I quite agree. I was very interested in that. He's no longer a priest. He's now married. I think his wife is a former nun. But even though he has come out of that world, if you like, he's still very much a believing and practicing Catholic. And so, yeah, I mean, the issues that you describe about sending your kids to Catholic school. I mean, in Ireland here, part of the difficulty that we have is that 96% of our primary schools are funded by the state but managed by the Catholic Church. So even if your kids are entirely safe, as the vast majority of them are, with very good teachers, it's the Catholic ethos and the Catholic doctrine that they're going to experience. So I've got 4 kids, and we've got no choice but to send them to a Catholic school. And my eldest is 12. So we got a form back from the school just a couple of weeks ago to give consent for my daughter to go through one of these personal development courses. So a lot of the context is just biological information for kids coming to puberty, and that's fine. But of course, it's a particular Roman Catholic view on that when they come to issues like sex ed, and some of it is just horrendous. I was telling Seamus before, one of the things that some of the Catholic groups do with school children who are 13, 14, 15 is they'll take a girl up out of the class and a few boys, and they get a big long piece of sellotape and they ask them to reach their arm out and they'll wrap the sellotape around the girl's arm and one of the boys' arms, and then they'll take the sellotape off, and the boy sits down, and another boy comes up, and they'll do the same thing with the same bit of sellotape with a new boy, and they'll do this 2 or 3 times, and then they'll hold up the bit of dirty sellotape and say, "This girl is now like this bit of sellotape, and she just like this bit of sellotape. She'll never be the same again because she had these sexual relations outside marriage." And it's just absolutely horrendous stuff, you know. So yeah, it's difficult to deal with when your kids are in that environment. Sometimes you feel like you have to send them off to school to be educated and then re-educate them when they come home again.
4 kids. You sure you're not Catholic? Or is
It's
that
too
like a
many.
small number?
It's too many. Do you want one, Zach? I'll give you one.
I had 2 cats. I barely can handle that. So a couple times you've done the arm crossing. Can you talk about the tattoos you got there? I think I saw Deuteronomy.
Close. I've got Leviticus. Can you see Leviticus?
Leviticus. Okay. Well,
Oh, sorry, I've got no
close.
muscles, but I've got. So that's Leviticus 19:28. That says. I'll not get it exactly, but it says something to the effect of, "I am the Lord thy God. Thou shalt not make tattoo marks on thy skin."
Yeah.
And this one is. Can you see that? No.
Yep.
That's
Got it.
the star map from the Voyager spacecraft. So it's Carl Sagan's star map, how to find Earth. If you have a view of the solar system, that'll help you find Earth. So that's for when I get abducted, inevitably one of these days. After they're finished probing me relentlessly, they'll know where to drop me off. And this one says, "I am star stuff in amino acids." So I think each of the amino acids has an initial, and if you string all of the initials together for the letters of "I am star stuff," that's what it looks like.
It's nice. Nice setup because I feel like isn't it one of the Leviticus lines about stoning gay people is like 3 verses away from the one
Yes.
saying don't get a tattoo. And it's in the same book, people. You could read it. It's not hard to find. It's in every hotel room you go to.
Yes.
Probably the same where you are. So how did you get involved with Atheist Ireland International?
Yeah, so there's I've been a member now, I think 4 years, 5 years, maybe. I'm not sure. I'm open to correction on that. So, if I'm honest, I just got too grumpy and sitting in front of the TV, listening to various Catholic people describe what the laws of the country were going to be, and I got increasingly fed up with that and thought I should probably do something about it. So, what Atheist Ireland does, I mean, the activities are really split into 2 separate areas. Sometimes we do debates, university debates, and things like that with religious people. So there was one last week about, is there an afterlife, and we'll do other debates like, where does morality come from? Does it come from God, or is it natural? So that kind of general public discourse type of stuff. But probably the majority of the work is lobbying politicians in relation to secular laws. So we want to change the legislation around a lot of areas in the education system and the health system in relation to religious laws. We want to get rid of the blasphemy law. And then, exactly as you say, Zach, within Atheist Ireland, I'm their nominee onto the board of Atheist Alliance International. So there was 2 sets of work that I did for AAI. I've been on the board now for I think around a year. So the first project that I was involved with was relating to a gender report. So we have a atheist census on the site that anyone can find if they take a look. And the atheist census reports from memory that it's around 75% male. So of the people in the world, there's hundreds of thousands of respondees, and of the people who have responded who self-identify as atheists, about three-quarters of male are male. And my colleague in Atheist Ireland, Aisling O'Brien, was keen not to ignore this. So we brought the issue to the board, and we ended up doing a consultation exercise around more than 100 different women and people who identify with non-male genders, who were scientists, journalists, parliamentarians, and we gathered a lot of responses and wrote a report. I have to say, I found that a rather difficult process. When we were chatting earlier, you mentioned social justice warriors, and I had to become familiar with a whole new set of language and terms that I wasn't familiar with before when I was discussing gender. And probably to be expected, a lot of the outputs were contested as well. So you'll find a lot of feminist activists who are very keen on things like gender quotas, and a lot of feminist activists who are very strongly opposed to gender quotas. So yeah, I find that quite difficult, if you like, to navigate a lot of the terminology. And once that was complete, we had a piece that referenced the report in National Geographic. So if anyone saw that, actually, there was an interview with Christine Chelska, who was the president of AAI at the time, and she talked very articulately and coherently about the results of the report. And the National Geographic article went on to describe the report and somehow managed to squeeze in the fact that the big problem is that Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris are terrible misogynists, and that's why there's so many male atheists. So I can save you the trouble of reading the report, Zach, and say that of all of the women that we interviewed, not one complained about Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris being terrible misogynists. Um, After that, then I went on, and I'm working at the minute on a project at the UN. So we have special consultative status at the UN, and we can arrange for our affiliates to attend UN committees and the UN Council. One of the specific issues that I'm spending too much time, I think, on at the minute relates to asylum for atheists. So you might have seen a lot of the stories about the Bangladeshi bloggers. Several people who have been blogging about secular issues have been murdered in really horrific attacks. And there's a hit list actually that the Islamists have published of which bloggers in Bangladesh are going to be next to be murdered. So we're helping some of those people as best we can to try and find asylum in the Western countries that they would like to move to. One of the difficulties that we found is that a number of the national asylum processes just inherit language from the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees, and that language talks about the religious ground for asylum. So if you're being persecuted as a religious minority, that's sufficient justification to be awarded asylum as a refugee. But it doesn't say anything about the non-religious people. So we have a number of cases where it looks like non-religious people who are being persecuted for their atheism, and being an apostate is a capital offense in a lot of countries in the world. But those people are treated less beneficially and less well than religious minorities. So we don't obviously want religious minorities to be treated any worse, but I think if you're a secular Bangladeshi blogger seeking asylum in the West, the least that you can expect is to be treated on an equal footing with the religious minorities. So we're doing some work along those lines at the minute also.
Yeah, I just would assume in most countries the atheist is going to be the minority, religious or otherwise.
That's true. Yep.
So what are you hoping? I mean, I know it's all about incremental goals sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
What is it? What do you think you can accomplish? With this address to the Human Rights Council.
Yeah.
Is that like? Can you think it's like? Can you get exposure, or do you actually think can we make some change here? I mean, we
Yeah.
talk about.
Yeah,
You're
so you're exactly right. It's been quite a busy few weeks for Atheist Ireland. We're actually the first atheist group to present to the full United Nations Human Rights Council as opposed to the committees. So just as background, there are human rights committees at the United Nations who are composed of a dozen or more very highly qualified human rights lawyers from a number of different countries. So it's not a political process at all, in that it's not one country examining another. What you have is state parties submit reports to the committee that's examined, there's an action plan, and then the state parties are expected to come back and they will be questioned by a committee of human rights lawyers on their progress. Now, these committees have a lot of work to do across a lot of countries, so they can't really be expected to understand the minutiae of the implementation of human rights law in a number of different countries. So the process involves NGOs like Atheist Ireland going and briefing the committee to let them know here's exactly what's happening on the ground. This is the story that you can expect to hear from the government. This is the area where we really need change. And that way the committee is better informed. And the Human Rights Council is where we have each different country represented, and they have a process called UPR, the Universal Periodic Review. So every so often, each country is examined by all of the other countries in the United Nations on their human rights record. Now, your question is exactly right in terms of those human rights bodies themselves being a little toothless to a degree. So, if the UN provides a report that says, well, the Irish blasphemy law is really a terrible idea and that should be repealed, that statement from UN bodies has no legal effect in Ireland. They can't change Irish legislation, but it becomes really very difficult for governments to argue points when they have an increasing number of human rights lawyers and other human rights bodies at the United Nations telling them that they're doing things wrong. These reports get a lot of press coverage, and I sometimes think when we see the press coverage here in Ireland, that people assume that these things just happen and this is what the human rights bodies do, but really they couldn't function at all if it wasn't for NGOs and other civic society groups going to properly brief the committees. So what we get out of the process is reports from the UN that describe where the difficulties are from a human rights perspective in Irish law, and that helps us lobby more effectively to have those laws changed here in Ireland. So the gay marriage referendum is one example of that, and we've also started to see some incremental change in the education system. So there is a notorious rule called Rule 68 for schools, which required schools to integrate the religious aspect of the curriculum throughout the entire school day, and that was repealed relatively recently too. So exactly as you say, Zach, yeah, it's kind of incremental change, and as we argue for each individual change, then having the opinion of well-respected international human rights bodies is certainly a help in that regard.
Well, let's get a little more local for you. Heard that the current Irish government is not addressing the blasphemy language. Could you talk about the blasphemy law in Ireland and what you're doing to make it go away.
Sure, yeah. The peculiar thing about the blasphemy law in Ireland is that it's new. So lots of Western countries still have blasphemy laws, but you typically find that they're quite archaic. They're kind of a hangover from previous generations. What makes Ireland an outlier is that we introduced a new blasphemy law relatively recently. So there's two aspects to it, one domestic and one international, and the international one is much more important. So domestically, there haven't really been any prosecutions, but really what we see is a chilling effect from the law. So when media organizations know that there's a possibility that they might be a case might be taken under this law, they're rather than kind of state their case and be prepared to fight their corner in court, it's just much easier for them to avoid the issue altogether. So there's a lot of self censorship. I can give you one example of that. I had agreed with a newspaper here in Ireland to write a guest article for them. And within the article, I referred to Mary as a carpenter's wife. And the editor told me that no, you can't print that. That's blasphemous to say that Mary's a carpenter's wife. People will consider that derogatory and blasphemous. So I explained,
Wow.
well, actually, it wasn't my idea that Mary was a carpenter's wife. That's what the gospel says. And in fact, if you're arguing that Mary wasn't a carpenter's wife, it's you that's committing the blasphemy. But I mean, the attitude of a lot of sub editors is that anything that they perceive as a little risque is just self-censored. It's not worth their time and money to go to court and argue the case. So really what we have is media based to a large extent on what the most conservative and reactionary Christians will tolerate. But the much more important aspect to it is the international one. So there's a group called the Organization of Islamic Countries. I think there are 52 members, different countries in the group. And at the United Nations, Pakistan, acting on behalf of the OIC, proposed exactly the wording of the Irish blasphemy law in an attempt to codify that into United Nations recommendations that other countries could adopt. So their view is that criticism of Islam or criticism of the Quran should be a crime in all countries, and they would like the UN to support that. And in an effort to defend their position from, as they would see it, more liberal Western countries arguing for free speech and free expression, they used the contemporary Irish blasphemy law to try and support their case for a similar codification of that legislation by the United Nations. So the difficulty for Ireland is, when you're being cited as best practice for blasphemy law by Pakistan, it's probably an indication that you're doing something wrong. Pakistan has been killing many people every year for decades for the crime of blasphemy. So I don't think they're really a very good example to be following.
Yeah, it's an odd kind of blowback because in the U.S. and maybe you get this. There's all this talk about like PC and people being too sensitive, and now the supposed other side, the religious side, the conservative, let's do things the way we always have, are trying to pass these laws, and I'm like, aren't you kind of being the same way? And that's kind of scary that the Islamic countries are kind of pushing for this. I mean, in my most cynical way, I'd be like, all right, everybody sign a piece of paper declaring your fealty to whatever religion you are, and then the blasphemy law will apply to you if you're in that religion. And then that'll make people really make a choice. Is like, well, if you're saying, hey, I'm not of this religion, sorry, blasphemy laws don't apply because I don't believe that. But it makes everybody susceptible. Didn't you mention in one of your shows that you were trying to get arrested for it, or trying to get at least attention for blasphemy, or was that something that Aaron Rod did when he was in Ireland? Darn you, Aaron.
Both, but both of us actually. So when the blasphemy law came into effect in Ireland, Atheist Ireland published 25 blasphemous statements on our website, and we've been doing our best to be prosecuted for blasphemy ever since. And the Aaron Ra interview, as you say, the last time Aaron was in Ireland, he was on national radio saying some less than complimentary things about the Christian faith, but still wasn't able to get himself arrested for blasphemy. But there are funny sides to it, But there's some sinister sides to it too. When the Charlie Hebdo cartoons were published, and after the massacre of the Charlie Hebdo staff in France, Atheist Ireland published the next edition, the cartoon from the front page. We had leaders of the Islamic community here making very overt threats on national television that they would seek to use the blasphemy laws to stop people publishing the Charlie Hebdo cartoons, which is really, in my view, an intolerable imposition on free expression. So I think, that's the main difficulty with blasphemy in principle, that free expression is really, it's the foundation of how all of us can learn. When you teach kids about the scientific method, you teach them it's about conjecture and refutation. It's about hypothesis and experiment. So anyone can have an idea, and you decide which ideas are true by experiment and attempting to refute them. And the tradition of blasphemy laws goes back to Galileo and Bruno, and all of those people who were silenced by the church. And while those are kind of celebrated cases from a long time ago, the same thing's true today. You can't figure out. I know I'm in my 40s now. I can look back to when I was in my 20s and look at all of the things that I believed then, and a large number of them are just plain flat wrong. And the corollary of that is the highly likely, and in fact 100% chance, that there's a bunch of things that I believe today that are wrong, and I would like to know which ones they are, and I would like to correct them. But you can't figure out which ideas you have are wrong if there's some ideas that you're not allowed to discuss. So this idea of expressing ideas and then trying to criticize them, and figuring out which ones are right and which ones are wrong. There's a name for that. It's called learning. And trying to suppress the discussion of certain ideas just seems like an inherently bad idea.
I have an eloquent response to all blasphemy laws. Fuck that shit.
Yes, indeed. That's. I don't think I would disagree with a single word of that. But I'm interested as well. You mentioned that sometimes you get both people on the religious right and others who would consider themselves to be on the liberal left, who would align in their positions on some of these issues, and apostasy is another one. So we had a new group formed here in Ireland quite recently. It's the ex-Muslims in Ireland. And you're probably aware that apostasy from the Muslim faith can often carry much more harsh consequences, including death, as compared to other faiths. So it's a very brave thing to do, to set up a new group of ex-Muslims. And rather predictably, it wasn't too long after that group was set up that they got credible death threats from Islamists. So not too far from here in Scotland, there was a Ahmadiyya Muslim man who was murdered for his faith quite recently. And these are credible threats that the police are taking seriously and investigating. So one of the members of the ex-Muslims of Ireland received the threat, and the threat said that anyone who's a member of this group and anyone who's an apostate from the Muslim faith will be killed. And as I say, these are not idle threats. These are credible threats made by people and groups who the police take very seriously. But largely, as you say, you just bizarrely you find some people on the liberal left who see this group who are really a minority within a minority. So the Muslim community would be a minority in Ireland, but the small minority within that group who decide to reject the tenets of the faith are extremely vulnerable. And you would think those people would immediately demand and earn the help and support of liberal, secular, left wing people. But a number of the comments that they got on Twitter were things like people questioning, oh, if you're just a mouthpiece for someone else, I want to know about it. So immediately treating the group with suspicion and distrust rather than offering help and support. And they were also told that they're a front group, which just removes all agency on volition from these people. You know, these people are perfectly eloquent and articulate group and are capable of expressing their own opinions. And by just telling them you're just a front group, essentially you're saying you're not capable of expressing yourself, and all you can do is express someone else's opinion for you. So really, when you think about it, some of these people would fancy themselves as anti-fascists. And if you look at what's happening, you have a group of Islamists who are saying, listen, if you deviate from the dogma and the agreed rules of this group, you will be killed as a result. And that kind of behavior fits neatly within the definition of fascism, as far as I'm concerned. So you have these Islamist fascists who are issuing credible death threats to this small minority group. And yet you have some people on the left in Ireland who would describe themselves as anti-fascists. And the reaction to that is not to offer help and support to the people who are the subject of the death threats. It's to question them with distrust and suspicion and to allege that they have no volition and no ability to express their own free will and their own ideas. And I really think that kind of behaviour is just despicable. So Atheist Ireland offered the ex-Muslims of Ireland some quite modest support. I think the majority of the support they'll get will be from Mariam Namazi's group. If you're familiar with Mariam, she had that awful podcast with Sam Harris not so long ago, which was it was just terrible to listen to. I mean, I admire both of those people, and I was kind of looking forward to it, you know. But I don't know how it got off the rails. But yeah, I think the Council of Ex-Muslims of Britain and Mariam's group will offer the ex-Muslims of Ireland a lot of help and support. And yeah, they deserve it because there's a lot of people in Ireland who should be giving them a lot more help and support.
Yeah, the one ex-Muslim I've interviewed, Aina, sorry, pronounced as bad. Nice
Nice
Mangoes,
mango.
polite
Yes.
conversations. I mean, she's in Canada, which is relatively safe, but still is using an avatar, not using a real name, which is totally understandable.
Exactly.
And I see her getting stuck in the middle. I don't know, it's like a really loud guitar riff, like you can't talk over it. Like anytime Muslims come up, people have no ability to have any kind of nuanced conversation. It's either you're 100% on the Islamist side or you're 100% on somebody else's side, and it's like you can't have that, and it's very scary for people who come out and you're like, oh, you're going to be supported, and then you're not being supported by a lot of people who call themselves liberals or even atheists, are treating ex-Muslims like they are still part of the cult, like the Catholic guy you interviewed who is still Catholic.
Yeah.
I mean, you still have the remnants of Catholicism yourself, but it's not like you can still identify as that and you are still part of them. You've escaped somehow. You dug your way out, and it's very impressive that you did. And dang, we've done about an hour or so. Before we cut things off, I do want to talk. So in the beer business in Ireland, I mean, do we get beyond Guinness? Is that possible? I know, craft beer is blown up here, but that's the only Irish beer I can think of, and I feel like it can do better.
Yeah, so there's a number of craft breweries in Ireland. I think the one of the more popular ones that we have craft beers who will sell you bottles of beer, but we have a number of pubs where the brewery is downstairs. You've possibly seen this model before. There's kind of a glass floor in the pub, and you can see the actual brewery downstairs. And they make, I think one of the more popular variants is oyster beer, which looks like a pint of Guinness, but it's made with actual oysters, which doesn't sound too appetizing, but is very nice. And the people of Cork would not forgive me if I didn't mention Murphy's. So whereas if you come to Dublin, most tourists will go to the Guinness factory at St James's Gate in Dublin. But in Murphy's or in Cork, they drink Murphy's, which again looks quite similar. But Cork people will tell you it's very different.
We got to represent, right?
That's it.
Okay, so is there anything else you want to talk about before we call it a night?
No, that was good fun. I appreciate your time. I'll put up a link also at our blog. So if anyone wants to visit that, it's the freethoughtprofit.com. So we'll have a number of blog posts and podcasts, interviews there. So we'll for sure put up a link to this discussion. That was good fun.
And where else can people find you and keep track of you, and Twitter, Facebook, however they track?
Yes, I'm not on Facebook, but I'm on Twitter at John Hamill 151. So as my friend Seamus is frequently humoured to point out, there is another John Hamill. He's a gay porn star. I very much wish I looked more like the other John Hamill, but unfortunately not. So I'm John Hamill 151.
Okay. Thanks for being on the show, and let me throw the outro here. So if you want to support this show, you can be like Bobby, Hugh, and Teote and support the show. Patreon.com/Zachrilege, ZACHRILEGE. And if I can spell it correctly after 2 beers, you can too. So next week, I will have on Stephen Hines to talk about his book, Rebirth Defect, My Journey from Catholic Altar Boy to Teen Atheist to Adult Christian Metal Evangelist and Back to Atheism. Just saying the book's name might take half the showtime, but I think it's going to be a fun discussion. So you can follow me on Twitter at Zachrilege, like my Zachrilege Cast page on Facebook. Send all hate mail to zachrilege.cast@gmail.com. Thank you, John, for being on tonight again. And for the listeners, stay safe. And if you need to chat, I am available. If you're an atheist and you feel alone, you are not alone. Reach out, let's chat, and get that human connectiveness that keeps people coming back every Sunday. Stay skeptical. I love all y'all, and good night.